Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Wiebe. I'm the director of the University of Michigan Injury Prevention Center based in Ann Arbor, and we're one of the 11 CDC-funded injury control research centers in the US. Welcome to our webinar series. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. I'm delighted to be able to give an introduction today for our speaker, Dr. Zainab Hans. Dr. Hans is a research investigator at the University of Michigan Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention, IFIP, and project director for the research and evaluation component of the Burn State Crisis Intervention Program in Michigan. Dr. Hans received her doctoral degree in economics from Wayne State University and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at IFIP. Her research integrates economic theory and quasi-experimental methods to examine the socioeconomic and structural determinants of interpersonal violence, firearm injury, and related public health outcomes. Her work spans intimate partner violence, child abuse, housing policy, and firearm injury prevention, with a particular focus on how macroeconomic factors shape vulnerability to violence across populations. She has an innovative approach that she's taken, and will start by describing to us what the darknet marketplace is, why there's a plausible link between the darknet marketplace and violence and crime, and the innovative methods that she's used to investigate that. So, Zainab, delighted to have you here. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm so excited to be here today and share some of my research that I've been working on recently with all of you. So before I get started, can you all see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you so much. So as Doug mentioned, my name is Zainab Hans. I'm a research investigator, and today the project that I'll be sharing with all of you looks into the darknet marketplaces. So the darknet marketplaces is not something that I was very familiar with too long ago. So I will start off by walking you through some of the background. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll not only understand what they are and how they operate, but also why they matter for public health, violence prevention, and the kind of research that we do at IFIP. So I'll start from the very beginning, assuming no prior knowledge. So if you already know what darknet marketplaces are, please bear with me. So all of us use the internet every single day without thinking too much about it. We open Chrome, Safari, go to Google, find what we need. But what we're accessing is actually only about 4% of the total internet. This is called the surface web. So everything that's indexed, searchable, and publicly accessible is called the surface web and comprises about 4%. The vast majority of the internet, about 90% of it, is called the deep web. Now, this is where your bank servers live, your email inbox also lives there, and any database that requires a login and is not indexed by Google is in the deep web. And then there is the dark web, which comprises about 6% of the total internet. And this is where it gets interesting. So the dark web requires a special software to access it, and it's deliberately anonymized and unindexed. It hosts a mix of things, and a vast majority of them are legitimate, like news sites for journalists operating in countries with censored media. However, it also hosts things that are illegal, such as weapons and illicit drugs. And that is what we will be focusing on today. So how do we access the dark web? The answer is a software called Tor, which stands for the Onion Router. So when you use a regular browser, your internet service provider and the websites you visit can see your IP address, which is basically your home address on the internet. So this is how advertisers can send you targeted marketing information. And also, if you commit a crime online, law enforcement can trace that activity back to you. Tor is designed to break that connection. So here's an analogy that I found very helpful. And imagine you want to send a letter to someone, but you don't want anyone to know where it came from or who it's being sent to. So instead of mailing it directly to the recipient, you seal it in several envelopes and address each one of the envelopes to a different person. The first person receives the letter, opens it, and finds another envelope inside it addressed to a different person and forwards it along. The second person does the same, and by the time the actual recipient receives the final letter, nobody in that entire chain knows both where it started from and both where it ended up. And this is the basic idea behind Tor. So your internet traffic is encrypted in 3 layers and is routed all over the world through volunteer servers called relays. Each relay strips one layer of encryption and passes the traffic along, and no single relay knows both the origin and the destination. So a website on the dark web cannot trace you, and your internet provider cannot see where you're going. To put things into context, about 2.5 million users use Tor every day, mostly for perfectly ordinary purposes, like journalists protecting sources, or activists operating in authoritarian countries, or even privacy-conscious everyday users. Only about 1.5% of the total Tor traffic actually goes to the dark web. So on the dark web, there are these darknet marketplaces, and what they are basically like any other marketplace. Think of Amazon, for instance. So you go to Amazon, you browse product listings with photos and descriptions. Sometimes you read reviews, you add something to your cart, you check out, and a package arrives at your door a few days later. Darknet marketplaces work identically, except the products are illegal. So they do have vendor ratings as well as buyer reviews, so you're aware of what you're buying. They also have dispute resolution mechanisms in case things go wrong. And they ship the product to you using regular postal service. So your postal carrier has no idea what's inside the package. There is a host of goods listed on these darknet marketplaces, and these include weapons, fake identity documents, stolen credit card information, and even hitmen for hire. But a vast majority of these product listings are actually drug-related. The payment is in cryptocurrency. Historically, it has been Bitcoin, but increasingly it's transitioning towards Monero, which is specifically designed to be untraceable. So the combination of the anonymity that Tor offers, combined with cryptocurrency, is what makes these markets so challenging to kind of pin down and shut down for law enforcement officials. So these are much larger than you'd expect. So at their peak in 2021, darknet markets collectively generated an estimated $2.7 billion in revenue, according to blockchain analysis. Drug-related trades on these platforms has been increasing over the past few years. In 2024 alone, there was a 20% increase relative to the year prior. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimate that the total drug sales on these darknet marketplaces comprise about 1.5% of the total drug sales in North America and Europe. Now, that may look like a really small amount, but the share has been growing significantly over the past few years. And when we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, even 1.5% represents a very large number. At the bottom graph that you see are basically darknet markets that a lot of their inventory was drug related, and you can see sales per day over time. So, what's happening? How is the landscape of drug use changing, and has changed over the last 10 or so years? So, the Global Drug Survey, which is one of the largest annual surveys of drug users in the world, and is implemented across 35 countries, found that in 2022, 10.8% of online drug users had purchased their drugs through the dark web in just over the last 12 months. This number has more than doubled since 2014. At 2014, it was at 4.7%, and it has more than doubled since. Another interesting fact is that 34% of the drug users who use darknet markets just only started using it in 2019. So you can see in the graph that the percentage of users transitioning from street transactions to these online platforms has been increasing every single year. Also, 9.2% of the respondents in a separate European studies that surveyed about 17,000 drug users said that they had never consumed drugs before they purchased an illicit drug from a darknet marketplace. So why do people choose darknet over street dealing, and why do we see more and more individuals transitioning towards it? The most commonly cited reasons are product quality, variety, and the ability to actually read reviews before purchasing, and also avoiding the dangers and the stigma of street transactions, right? And this last point has real implications for harm reduction. So when you are not purchasing drugs from online vendors, then you can put yourself in harm's way physically in terms of violence, and also you have less control over the quality of product that you're consuming because there are no reviews for you to browse through. So why does any of this matter for people who do research in injury prevention and public health? The first one is obviously overdose mortality. Darknet marketplaces were among the earliest distribution channel for illicitly manufactured fentanyl in the United States. And in the beginning, the buyers were not even aware that they were purchasing fentanyl. It was just mixed into other drugs like heroin to increase potency and cut costs without the buyer's knowledge or consent. The second reason it's important is what I call the displacement problem. So when a major online drug market is shut down, buyers do not just stop using drugs. They transition, they substitute, they go somewhere else. And where they tend to go is to street vendors, local dealers, local drug distribution networks, and the more traditional drug supply chain. So this transition from a relatively transparent online marketplace with quality ratings to an opaque street market dramatically changes the risk profile for the buyers. The third is something that I just mentioned, which is that the user base has been growing significantly. It has doubled since 2014, and since then, since 2021, more and more people have been transitioning towards these platforms. And the fourth and final point is where my research come in, is that all of this creates a series of natural experiments. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but these marketplaces tend to be pretty short-lived. And each time a marketplace is seized or closed, shut down, we get a sudden, largely unexpected disruption from a drug distribution perspective. And this change allows us to ask questions like, what happens when these markets close down? Do overdose deaths increase? Does street violence increase? And, how does the composition of drug supply changes? So that is what that is what prompted this particular research that I'll be sharing with all of you today. But before I delve into that, just wanted to give you a quick overview of the evolution of these darknet markets. So it started in 2011. The very first darknet marketplace was called the Silk Road, and it was quickly dubbed the Amazon of drugs. It had about 4,000 vendors and over 100,000 buyers. And before it was shut down in October 2013 by the FBI, it had almost like $1 billion in sales. However, within a few weeks of the shutdown of the original Silk Road 2 appeared on the dark net. And since then, there have been hundreds of marketplaces that have popped up over time, and some of these have also been shut down over time. The most significant one of these, perhaps, was in 2014 in an international operation called Project Onimus. It involves 17 countries, large operation that seized about 400 darknet marketplaces sites simultaneously and shut them down. The second significant shock came in 2017 when the two largest markets that were operating in the world at that time, Alphabet and Hansa, were shut down in a project similar to Operation Onimus. 2019, Dream Market was, it wasn't shut down. That was actually a voluntary exit. But Dream Market, as you can see in the graph below, represented one of the largest retailers in terms of drug transactions. So it almost seems like a game of whack-a-mole when you look at the evolution that, you shut down one site, more pop up, and the growth has been consistent, and this pattern has been consistent where, as soon as one marketplace shuts down, there's several others that pop up to replace it. Now, most of these, as I said earlier, they are pretty short-lived and have a lifespan of just over 1 year, about 373 days on average. However, the larger ones operate for many, many years before they're shut down. So of the marketplaces that have been shut down so far, 12.5% were rated by law enforcement authorities, about 10% were hacked, 38.75% were actually scams, and 26.25% exited voluntarily, while the remaining shut down for reasons that are not known at this time. And as of right now, there are like hundreds of darknet marketplaces that are operational right now. So what I'm interested in is finding out what happens when a marketplace shut down. So some of the global drug use surveys that are implemented across countries kind of give us some clue. We know from previous research that a Russian marketplace called Hydra that was seized and shut down in 2021 produced a huge shock. The market of online drug sales actually declined by nearly half, although it did recover quite rapidly. By 2023, it was back up to like $1.7 billion. However, survey data shows us that prior shutdowns that happened earlier towards 2014 had a much larger impact on drug use. So as you can see from these graphs, the 2017 impact, as more people stopped using drugs after the shutdown compared to the shutdowns that occurred in 2019. So the reason being is that as technology has advanced, these advancements have allowed these vendors to quickly transition to other platforms once one marketplace is shut down. Vendors also operate across different platforms, so the transition is actually pretty seamless. However, what we do not know too much about is that what happens to crimes when marketplaces shut down. And this is where my research comes in. So, do displaced buyers actually move to street dealers? We don't know, so we're going to try to estimate using some law enforcement data. So basically, the theoretical mechanism I'm interested in testing is the market displacement. You know, if online purchasers divert towards street level transactions, then that can result in higher crime, both interpersonal kind of crime that is influenced by drug use, and also crime that is committed by gangs and parties that are involved in retail drug trade at a street level. So this, whether or not crime increases or decreases, will depend on how seamlessly users can transition from their online purchases to the street markets. So the data that I'm going to be using in this study comes from the dates and times of closures and the length each darknet market was operational for, comes from the European Union Drug Agency. The violence and crime outcomes that I'll describe in a little bit come from law enforcement records from the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And basically what this is that it's a census of crimes reported to participating agencies. And it includes crimes like assault, kidnapping, murder, domestic violence, so on and so forth. We use population data from the Census Bureau and also data on the number of law enforcement officers present in each jurisdiction from the LEOCA files. So what we do here is basically construct outcomes at an agency level. So each law enforcement agency, we have daily counts for several different outcomes, which involve assault, domestic violence. Domestic violence comprises of intimate partner violence, child abuse, as well as any kind of other violent crime towards a family member. So it's a global, more general measure of domestic violence. We also construct an outcome that measures how many crimes had any illicit drug involvement that was noted by the law enforcement agencies, and also a measure for gang-related violence. So before I go into my analytical approach, just wanted to give you an overview of the darknet marketplaces that are included in this current analysis. The first shutdown occurred in 2012, and the last one, our analysis is limited to 2019. So over this period, we've had several marketplaces shut down. I have focused on the most prominent ones, the larger marketplaces that can be expected to produce like a change in violent crime. So this graph basically gives you an overview of which marketplaces were shut down in which year. To assess the impact on my outcomes, I use a regression discontinuity in time to examine the impact of these shutdowns. And the fundamental idea over here is pretty straightforward. If the shutdown caused a meaningful change in crime and violence, we should be able to see a sharp break in crime right at that exact time. So to estimate this, we build a stack design. Like I showed in the slide before, we've had several shutdowns over a number of years. So rather than treating each shutdown as a single before and after comparison, we stack these market closures and have each one of these events contribute its own variation before and after the closure date. So we examine outcomes within a 15-day window before the closure and after the closure at the agency level. So each agency is restricted. The agency sample is restricted to agencies that submitted all 12 months of their data to the FBI at that time of the closure. And by pulling across these multiple events and agencies, we do increase our identifying information quite dramatically. It gives us more power, basically. So we use a negative binomial model that can, accommodate inflated zero counts, which can be expected when you're measuring crime and violence at such granular outcome at an agency day level. We absorb all of our fixed effects at the agency and event level, which means that all of the time invariant differences between agencies in the given window, the remaining variation should come from the closure. We also control for the day of week effects, as crime and violence tend to differ dramatically between weekdays and weekends. So we include binary variables for that. And finally, we include a population offset to control for different sizes of these agencies. So now I did want to pause here and acknowledge a couple of important limitations. So this is not like a clean difference in difference design. In our difference in difference analysis, you'd have a group of agencies that would receive the treatment, and you compare the outcomes of those agencies to a separate group that never received the treatment, and the differences between the outcomes will give you the treatment effect, right? However, in case of darknet marketplaces, we do not have a control and a treatment group. So it doesn't offer that kind of clean geographic variation. The shutdowns produce a nationally distributed shocks and affect wires all over the country at the same exact time. So what we can do is that instead of having a comparison and control state, we assess the discontinuity and outcomes over time. So our approach basically compares the same place to itself across time. And given that our analysis window is so narrow, it's the 30 days, 15 days before the closure, 15 days after, our assumption is that in combination with each agency serving as its own control, there would be no shock that can confound our analysis that will simultaneously affect all of these thousands of agencies that are included in our analysis at that exact same date. So given that basically our pre-period tells us what crime was looking like, what the trend was, absent the shock, and then the post period tells us what happens after the marketplace shuts down. And by pooling these multiple events, we're not relying on just like a single event to identify the effect, but allowing each one of these events to contribute its own independent variation. Now, what did we find? And keeping it simple, just presenting some simple coefficients that show us how the trends change afterwards. Our coefficients are on a log scale because we did use a negative binomial model. So a negative coefficient basically means that the daily rate of the crime or the outcome in question was decelerating or actively declining after the closure relative to its pre-closure trajectory. So basically a positive coefficient will mean the opposite, that after the darknet market closure, that particular outcome started to accelerate. So one thing that I wanted to acknowledge is that magnitude of these coefficients is going to be small in absolute terms. We are talking about changes in daily growth rate of crime incidents at like a law enforcement agency level. However, as these effects accumulate over days, and you consider that we have about thousands of agencies included in our analysis, these do add up. So let's look at our first outcome, which is assault. It is the largest and most precise estimated effect in our results, highly statistically significant, and the largest effect that we find in the 15 days after market closures. So this is kind of opposite to what you would expect if you thought about, okay, if you're transitioning from purchasing online to going out in the streets and acquiring your drugs from a street vendor, then you may put yourself in harm's way where you can be, physically assaulted or attacked. However, we're seeing an opposite effect. So this perhaps is coming from the fact that the interpersonal violence that is induced through drug use we see a decline in that. And that story is kind of mirrored when we look at domestic violence, which combines IPV, child abuse, and any physical towards another family member. We see similar and significant decline in those types of crimes in 15 days after the MarketNet exposure too. So this is consistent with previous research that shows that drug use has an influence on family violence. And the story perhaps here is that the lack of availability of drugs and the conflict that ensues after drug use is declining as supply is going down. Our next outcome is actually a kind of accusative sort of crimes: theft, burglary, robbery. There's a huge literature that shows that in order to be able to finance drug purchasing, accusative sort of crimes tend to go up with higher rates of drug use. However, we see a significant negative effect, the p-value of like 0.034. It is weaker than our findings of assault, but it's still statistically meaningful. The next two outcomes that we have are drug offenses, which is a measure of any incident that was reported to a law enforcement agency where the offender or the victim had some kind of drug involvement, basically. And we do see that that's negative, but it's statistically insignificant. Gang violence, on the other hand, is the only outcome that shows a positive coefficient. So this would be consistent if street activity was going up, if people were transitioning to street vendors to be able to acquire their drugs. So that is consistent with that story. However, it is not statistically significant. So these results do require some careful interpretation, and I do not want to oversell them. The direction of the significant findings is opposite to what I thought originally when I started looking into this question, and what, the displacement hypothesis I had in mind, which was like if marketplace closures push buyers towards street dealers, street dealing generates territorial competition, violence, we would see an increase in crime after closure. However, we see the opposite over here, although when you do kind of like dig into it, there is theory and previous literature that supports like the declining drug use. You should expect a decline in interpersonal violence. So I think the story over here is demand suppression. And another thing that I wanted to acknowledge is because not every agency, sorry, not every agency has a particular incident of that particular outcome. Then for gang violence, we only have about 820 agencies that reported gang violence within that window. So we may be underpowered to detect that. And just kind of a visual representation of what we've discussed. So we see a negative, insignificant effects for assault, domestic violence, and accusative crimes. However, for crimes involving drugs and gang violence overall, the effects are not significant. And gang violence in particular has incredibly large confidence intervals. So we have to be a little bit careful over that. So I will wrap up with just saying that although, darknet drug markets represent like a fraction of the overall um, drug retail market, however, it generates billions of dollars annually and is growing every single day. And the share of users that are abandoning more traditional drug distribution networks and transitioning to these online platforms is growing every single year. So our analysis did find declines in several forms of violence after these marketplace shutdowns. However, we are examining a pretty narrow window, so cannot say what happens over the long term or the medium term, as technological advancements have made it easier for vendors to either switch platforms altogether or operate on multiple platforms simultaneously. So in future subsequent shutdowns may not have as big an effect. It's hard to say what impact they'll have, what impact future shutdowns will have on these outcomes. So with that, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you for any questions that you may have.
Dr. Hans, fascinating. Thank you so much. I don't know if my vocabulary has ever expanded so much with a single talk. That was really interesting, and so much is new to me, and I'm sure new to our audience also. Appreciate it. Everyone, you are welcome to provide comments and questions in the Q&A feature. And Zainab, I've already received one already. I'll read this to you. Your findings are based off a 15-day window around the closure time, which is fairly short. This person asks, can you explain why you didn't choose a wider window and examine that?
Yeah, absolutely. This was actually kind of like an administrative decision, and I am going to share my screen again to go back to that one slide that we had that showed when these occurred. So the largest shutdown occurred in 2014 in terms of the sheer number of darknet marketplaces that were shut down. This occurred on November 5th, 2014. Which if we extend past the 2 weeks, then we include the Thanksgiving weekend. And I was trying to, we do see crime rates kind of going down around holiday weekends. So I was trying to avoid that window. And also there is previous research that shows that over time, these vendors have become pretty adaptable. They can switch and transition to new platforms fairly easily. So I didn't have ex ante and like what the window should be to see how long the impact would last. So that's why I was conservative in terms of like estimating.
Very good. Thanks for that. And I'll add, Of course, I really appreciate how innovative you were in finding a way to study this very novel and important question, but also how level you were and tempered you were with making sure that you didn't overstep the bounds of what you might find. Um, so interesting. Well done. Um, Another question for you. Um, this one is also some fan mail. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Comes from Sophia. What do you foresee happening to darknet markets for illicit drug markets? What do you foresee happening to darknet markets for illicit drugs in the next 10 years, especially with the rise of AI?
Yeah. So I think the trend so far tells us that more and more users are transitioning towards these platforms. They are interestingly, there also seems to be quite a significant cartel activity happening. So there's some previous research that shows that about 1% of all of the vendors um, are responsible for over 50% of all of the drug listings that are available on these darknet markets, right? And when you look at the size of these listings, how in this particular area of research, anything over $1,000 is called wholesale activity. So these retailers are, or these vendors are selling huge quantities of products. So there's research that shows that there's cartels and organized crime syndicates that are operating on these channels because they have pretty much saturated the market in, North America. So they're trying to look for buyers in other continents and using these tools to be able to reach them. So in terms of there's two sides. We can anticipate activity growing over time, but because these websites actually have a review feature where buyers, actually authenticated buyers that have bought the product, can leave reviews, it also gives the end user some element of control over the quality of product that they're purchasing. So the public health impacts also kind of remain a little bit ambiguous.
Thank you so much. Zainab, your friend and colleague, Dr. Joanne Constantine from SUNY Downstate is here. She starts with a compliment. Wonderful and very timely information. Thank you so much! Exclamation mark. Here's a question from Joanne. Given that subsequent shutdowns may not replicate this effect, what would you recommend to policymakers who see takedowns as a violence reduction tool? Is the current evidence enough to justify continued enforcement resources, or does it argue for a different strategy entirely?
Yeah, so that is a very interesting question. And I think, given the fact, so I would like to preface it by saying that my research looks at just like what's happening in terms of crime and violence, right? There's a whole lot that's happening on these darknet marketplaces, which I mentioned earlier. You can buy like fake identity documents, you have stolen access to stolen credit card information. You can buy weapons or hire a hitman if you want to get somebody killed, right? So the implications of these shutdowns are larger than what my research over here, what the current project is able to show. Although so one thing that I wanted to mention is that the closures that I looked at were a mix of voluntary departures from the market as well as FBI raids, right? So I did not distinguish between two. In gearing up for this presentation, when I was running analyses on just like the markets that were raided by law enforcement agencies, the largest effects that were dominating were coming from Project Onimus in 2014. So that I think the implications, the policy implications of this need to be carefully evaluated and need more data and more information than the current project presents, or I'm able to get at this point. But I think with the given technological advancements and even drug uses, right? Now we have like new forms and new variants of drugs that are becoming available to the users that can be very, very lethal. And even, Narcan is ineffective in reviving those users. So I think there's going to be some form of enforcement that's going to be focused on shutting these marketplaces down going into the future.
Thank you. Zainab, let's do one more. Here's a question about using NIBRS as your outcome, National Incident-Based Reporting System. You reported using crime data from NIBRS as your outcome. We know domestic violence is significantly underreported. Do you think reporting behavior itself could be changing around marketplace closure dates in ways that would bias your estimates? For example, if victims are less likely to call police during periods of heightened law enforcement activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the sample of agencies that is included in this particular analysis is local law enforcement agencies like the Detroit Police Department or the Ann Arbor Police Department, your local PDs, right? These enforcement actions by law enforcement authorities occurred at a much higher and federal level. For example, Project Onimus was conducted across 17 countries, and it was conducted by FBI. So I wouldn't expect that to contaminate how local law enforcement agencies operate. In many cases, we're talking about many small local PDs who may not even be aware of this larger operation going on. So I wouldn't expect that to contaminate the findings that I presented today. And I did want to acknowledge, yes, IPV in particular, because NIBRS does contain information on the relationship between victim and offender. And in many, many cases, that is missing. So that causes like a structural problem of underreporting within the data. However, across like several outcomes, we do see a consistent signal of what the closures are doing. So that gives us more confidence in the IPV results.
Oh, that's a great point.
Domestic violence results.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hans from the Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention at U of M. Yeah, it's great to learn from you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all of our guests for coming and learning with us. Thank you to Taylor and Jill and Nicole at the Injury Prevention Center for hosting. Thank you also to Russell Video for the hardware and the orchestration in the background. It's been a pleasure. We look forward to seeing you at a future Lunch and Learn. All right. Have a
Thank you
great
so
day.
much.
Thanks again.
Thank you.